capable of. There is this key role of local governments for the development, but then this is not seen in the budgetary allocation, in theme programs, and this is all seen with a very simple activity. Looking at the declaration coming out of this summit, how many times local governments are mentioned? Well, just once, only once in the declaration, and the roadmap stemming from there has defined over 30 actions, 30 activities, and only one refers to dialogue sessions with the local authorities and civil society. Local authorities always hand in hand with civil society. So we have all these amazing speakers with us today representing local governments and different fora and networks of local governments. Equal, yes, thank you so much. I was going to say this. Thank you so much for adding and contributing. Mr. Albiol is not here, but let's prove to him that this equality between men and women is always positive, and all public policies have differences, of course, between men and women. So I'm going to suggest dynamic here. Let's do 3 rounds. Let's see if we have time for that. And in each round, I'm going to ask a question, which will be the same for all. You will have 4 minutes each for your answers. So please try to be brief in your answers. And I'm going to be a sort of time curator, and I am very disciplined with this, so I ask you to be so as well. So the first question, which is a double question, is as follows. What is the impact, or what impact do you believe you see in local governments and their work? This renewed strategy started up by the European Union, CELAC, and this initiative of the Global Gateway. What is the impact of all this? And then what contributions do you believe can be made from local governments? If you agree, we will first go to the European perspective. This is a strategy that has been essentially launched by the European Union. Let's go to the European perspective and then the Latin American perspective. So we will first hear from Céline Papin, Patrick Molino, secondly, and José Luis, thirdly. So, Céline, you have the floor. Thank you very much. It's up to me to start. Thank you so much for inviting me. And please forgive my Spanish. Sometimes I'll need to find my words, but I'll try to express myself as best as possible. So, first, regarding the question in the Global Gateway, this is an investment plan. So I would aim the question rather to my colleagues from Latin America to truly see the current impact of all this. And from the standpoint of French local governments, I believe it's too early to truly see the impact. As for the strategy of the collaboration between the European Union and CELAC, it is true that this new stage is a very positive sign to strengthen relationships between our two continents at a time. I'm not going to repeat what has been said in the previous panel, but at a time with a political context full of tensions, conflicts, many crises. And it is true that, in our opinion, we believe this is a very relevant strategy that will very likely support us in our decentralized cooperation strategies. As pointed out before, there's been a lack of political push in recent years regarding this collaboration between our continents, and this can also be told at a local level. In France, the number of decentralized cooperations between France local governments in France and local governments in Caribbean and Latin America has dropped very dramatically in recent years, and therefore we have started at the level of Cité Unité France, a new dynamic, which is the Latin America Caribbean dynamic, with the idea of showing all the interest of the development of these collaborations. So we're very pleased to see that we have the same ambition at a European level. How can local governments to contribute to this implementation? That was your second question. So I would say that perhaps the question is not the right one, because it translates a very top-down view when we must also take into account a bottom-up view. It is as considering that nothing was done at first, and we all know that there is diplomacy that works, and we see each other in other places, in other networks, and we have that pleasure of seeing each other and talking about many different cooperation issues and things that concern us all. There's also decentralized cooperation projects with very specific events in the territories, with lots of reciprocity. And I believe it's a very relevant element in terms of capacity building, urban services, urban models that are more sustainable. There's numerous cases of decentralized cooperation. And I would additionally like to add that these strategies speak of the economic part, which is essential to offer new conditions to have a sustainable economic development with greater opportunities. But we must recall that at least in France, 70% of public investment is done locally. And it's up to the local governments to create the working conditions for those investments in the territory by creating all the necessary elements for the starting up of a new company, for instance. And they truly have a key role for the implementation of that strategy. So I would ask the question as follows: how can that strategy can have an effect in helping it to land locally? So what technical and financial tools can the European Union provide to help us create those conditions for a local landing thereof? Thank you very much, Patrick. I would firstly like to thank you for the invitation. I was in July in Brussels with you, and I spoke about the situation, but I'm not going to do like my colleague. I'm not going to speak Spanish. I'll turn to French, which is easier for me. So, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I represent here today the European Committee of Regions, which, as you know, brings together the representatives of the local authorities of the 27 countries in the European Union to try to have a formal influence through their own initiatives in the EU actions. Obviously, our work is to prove day after day how the local corporations and governments contribute to the proper implementation of public policies. 70% of the European regulation is implemented at the level of local authorities, and therefore it is very important, in our opinion, to defend this role and this place, this space. The impact of the new strategy and the global gateway of the European Union at the time or at present is very difficult to describe specifically. We are at the very beginning of this story. We have this goal of 300,000 3 billion for mobilization, but we need to see whether this figure is reached and how it becomes more specific and is landed on a daily basis. At any rate, we cannot achieve this strategy cannot be successful if local authorities are not very clearly and tightly involved, and it is a difficult to reach challenge because there needs to be a will by the states and by the union, but also local authorities need to have the capacity to act. Although I'm the first defender of local authorities, but it is not the same to look at the city of Barcelona or the very beautiful metropolis of Bordeaux to participate in international cooperation than perhaps for other smaller municipalities that also have a significant role to play. So we need to have and work hard to integrate local authorities. I want to mention the initiative of the Committee of the Regions and the Commission. At the end of the month, 29th of November, 1st of December, there's a Forum of Citizens for International Partnerships, whose ambitions will be to provide a territorial perspective on this global gateway strategy of the European Union. And it is all about contributing to the definition of the role and space for local authorities, because at this point, this has not yet been developed. It is a will, but a will that has not yet found a formal translation into the strategy. The Civics Committee, responsible for foreign affairs of the committee that I preside, will be part of this global gateway platform. But once again, we're at the beginning of the story, and our collective movement and each layer of responsibility, and every time there's the possibility of doing a public event such as this one is, well, something that is totally strategic, and that's what we will do on the 30th of November and 1st of December. The involvement of local authorities needs to find its specificity through the strengthening of cooperation, decentralized cooperation actions, but also through the recognition, greater and increasing recognition of our local authorities and the role that we must play. Obviously, things are not identical in a federal country with very strong regions than in a very centralized country such as France, for instance, where even though local authorities have a very significant role, whatever is essential is done at a state level. At any rate, this can only work if we all move in the same direction, and I'm talking about local authorities and national authorities. And this it's not always easy for national authorities to leave some space or at least be equal or have an equal relationship in international issues with local authorities. I believe that the local dimension, as we've seen so far, does not appear in the final statement or declaration of the Youth Alac summit in June, and it is neither mentioned in the statement of the Commission on the new agenda with Latin America and the Caribbean. This is an issue. We need to duplicate our efforts in terms of advocacy, and we also need to continue insisting on decentralized cooperation actions in each of our states. I'm vice president of a national commission that enables and facilitates the work around this decentralized cooperation. But at any rate, the support to specific decentralized cooperation with specific practices is essential, because it's what will allow us to see how the money of this global gateway is translated into specific changes in the territories.
Patrick.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And to conclude with the European vision, I'll give the floor to José Luis. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation and for allowing me to participate. The moderator was asking me whether I'd be speaking as a mayor or from the Federation of Municipalities and Regions, and they're closely linked. The FEMP is the administration that regulates municipalism and that supports municipalism in Spain. And I will be sharing my experience as a mayor. And as I wanted to say from the outset, is that all social transformations that are required require the participation of municipalism. And by all, I mean any action. For instance, if we think of next generation funds, where they're being implemented at a territorial level, who manages the territorial level? Municipalities and their mayors. So, as a staunch municipalist, I believe we must recover, demand, and talk with the states and the regions, whether it's in Spain or in other decentralized countries, as the previous panelist said. At the end of the day, things happen in municipalities at a territorial level, and that is where we need to have the competencies and the funding. Very briefly, because we don't have much time, I'll just share that yesterday I was in Brussels. I was attending a meeting of a European program for the reconstruction of Ukrainian municipalities. Some Spanish, European municipalities rather, are participating in this program. And I won't share all the projects that I've participated in recent years. I'm the vice president of the Development Cooperation Committee of FEMP. I'm also a member of the Congress of Local Powers of the Council of Europe in Brussels. I have been in Angola to discuss decentralization through a FEMP program in the City Council. We have a memorandum of understanding with a municipality in Jordan. I visited the Dominican Republic talking to mayors. And everything I'm saying is to summarize, in summary, is to say that mayors, men and women from around the world, we all speak the same language. We all speak the same language. We face the same challenges and we find the same solutions. Regardless, and I want to say this from the onset, regardless of the political parties we are from. At FEMP, I've been the vice chair when the chair was from the People's Party and from the Socialist Party, and we got along great. So all of these different projects I've mentioned, where I've met mayors from Jordan or the Dominican Republic, or with the Congress of Local Powers in Brussels, I use all of this to talk of a concept that I think is really important, and that is city diplomacy. This concept still needs to be developed, and we have to improve it, obviously, together with all of those who are municipalists. And we also need to convince other administrations, such as regional administrations and state administration in Spain and in other countries. We need to convince them, as I was saying before, that everything happens in municipalities. So, going back to your question, what impact will the renewed EU Select strategy have? Well, I think having a human rights and democracy-based approach that is also based on equality. I mean, in the previous panel, they mentioned the big challenge we face as a society, and that is to achieve gender equality and equal opportunity, I'd add, for all people. Well, I am convinced, and I'll conclude on that, Sonia. Mayors are very demanding in terms of time. So, Sonia, I know I'm reaching the end of my 4 minutes, but I'm convinced that this renewed strategy and that the participation of local governments in the strategy will improve things in our territories and on our planet. Thank you so much. Thanks for sticking to time. Let's move on to the Latin American vision. And from what I'd like to repeat what Céline Papin said, in the sense that we had to rephrase the question perhaps and ask ourselves, what can the EU do to support local governments in landing this global gateway and the renewed strategy? Moving on to the Latin American view, I would next give the floor in the following order, first to Omar Ceballos, then Lely Caravantes and Sandra Singh, thirdly, Omar. Good morning. Thank you very much to the City Council of Barcelona. For us in Ecuador, in the Magura province, in the canton of Cotacachi, it's essential to hold discussions about these alliances and that they continue over time. We see this as a learning process, a mutual learning process, and we've talked of negative things, pandemics, wars, inequalities, but we've also seen positive developments. Where there is a collective social participation as well as individual participation based on gender equality in my canton, especially with regards to the participation of Indigenous women, we've seen positive outcomes. And the fundamental pillars for us are the right to collective participation. I'd insist once again, without forgetting about individual participation. Another essential pillar is that we can go back to the discussions on environmental governance. In our case, we have fundamental issues faced by Indigenous women who've been recognized by FAO as holding a wealth of food and agriculture heritage. Just a few months ago, we must add the defenders of the rights of nature and water with USMID, which is the Sustainable Water Reserves Management. And then there's the issue of the Chakra Andina relating to Indigenous women, which is important in terms of the ancestral practices and also recovering native seeds in the Andean region. Another key element for us is the issue of energy transition beyond climate change. We need to discuss on water issues. We are faced with a very serious situation in Latin America, and more specifically in Ecuador and Cotacachi, that is the issue of mining. The economic resources must be very often coming from open pit metal mines, but we need to also defend nature through the options I expressed. But we're also looking at a system of hydroelectric power plants, which is thanks to the amount of rivers we have in Ecuador. We have power cuts in Ecuador at the moment, so it's important for local authorities and regional authorities, and we have the prefect of Omnimaboda. It's important, as I was saying, to come up with international and national alliances. I'm part of the AMI, the Association of Municipalities of Ecuador, and it's important in the regions to have alliances with the prefecture of Imbabura. And when it comes to hydroelectric power plants, we have to link it to the issue of mobility. When we visit cities in Europe, and this same is applicable to Quito and Guayaquil in Ecuador, we see traffic jams and the use of fossil fuels. And we have to think of smaller municipalities which represent the vast majority of cities in Ecuador. We have to pacify our streets, either having fewer cars on the roads or having cars moved by renewable energy, or having fewer cars parked on streets to have more parking space and fewer aerial cables. For us, this is essential, and in this regard, we have started some endeavors, always bearing in mind the participation in decision-making, not just through a consultation, not just to put a check on the list, but rather to empower women. And it's been a great experience so far for us. And in this regard, we hope to be able to take some decisions on redistributing power and co-governance, not just in terms of local authorities, but also thinking of civil society and civil society organizations that have their own way of electing their authorities, so that they too can participate. And for us, it's fundamental in a rural province to motivate and encourage rural populations to not migrate to urban environments. And we'll only be able to do this if we achieve gender equality. We must also offer the possibility for people and communities, and a lot of the work happens in the rural area. Very often it's men who migrate to the city, so it's women have to do this. So we have to be able to supply the population with basic services and also provide for leisure activities for their sons and daughters, so that when these children go to these leisure activities, the mother can rest and have revenue generating activities, which for us is essential in terms of gender equality. Thanks, Omar. Lily, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Coming from Guatemala, I represent Deputy Mayor in the opposition at the Municipal Council of the Republic of Guatemala, on behalf of a new political party, and she represents a social organization, La Comuna, which did a lot of advocacy in the Municipal Council. We share many similarities with Ecuador, such as the presence of indigenous populations in the general population, and also the need to preserve natural resources, that is water resources, land resources. We have to protect them from the food and nutritional insecurity we face in our country. We have indicators that are very similar to those in some African countries, despite being a country with a huge amount of natural resources. And the power of citizens in local authorities today, as we see in Guatemala, we are showcasing this through an organization such as the 48 cantons that are fighting together with the urban population in Guatemala to defend the democratic rights in our country. Obviously, this has a national impact in Latin American countries, especially those more vulnerable and unequal. That is the impact of the strategy. But the conditions when it comes to decentralization are quite weak in the country. Guatemala is a state where the state is absent in rural areas, and because of this weak monitoring system of public policies, makes it very difficult to know how this strategy may have an impact on the territories. To this, we have to add high levels of corruption and a little democracy that wipes out the existing legal frameworks. We have a law on local participation running from the local to the national level, but this law has been deeply affected by the corruption affecting the country. So, going back to the question, and I echo the words of Celine in the sense that we should rephrase the question as to how can local governments contribute. I think very often local authorities are ignored. We need data that is disaggregated by territories to measure the advances and regressions in the implementation of this strategy. We need a territorial approach that comes through the local governments and decision-making spaces. We need to come up with an analysis of the situation, and for that we need data that is disaggregated territorially. And I think we face big challenges precisely when it comes to disaggregated data based on sex and ethnic origin. We have a majority of ethnic population in the country, and they're not a minority. In fact, they're a majority of the population, but nevertheless, very often they are invisibilized in national statistics. The statistics don't show this diversity. So when we come up with a strategy, we need to strengthen the exchange between similar countries. Guatemala is an isolated country, we could say, in Central America. It's a country that is more similar to Ecuador, to Peru, and Bolivia, to other Central American countries because of the rich diversity of indigenous population that is working hard for natural resources to be preserved and to contribute to food and nutritional security for the population. We also face challenges. We are lacking indigenous mayors. They have to be running parallel to the hegemonic power in the country. And these indigenous leaders must also participate in this gateway project in Latin America, especially with regards to the most vulnerable countries. We faced with a lot of environmental vulnerability. We're the fourth most vulnerable country in terms of the environment, and I therefore believe this strategy, which is fundamental for the development of countries, must be able to be reflected at a territorial level. Thank you so much, Lily. And next I'd give the floor, last but not least, to Sandra Singh in this round. The floor is yours, Sandra.
Thank you very much. And I come from the Caribbean with deep gratitude to Spain, which now holds the presidency at the EU Council. And I think perhaps it is more than just strategy, or perhaps it is providence that brought us to this place at this time as citizens from the Latin American and Caribbean community. For me, it's a reflection on our history that we're here at this forum addressing the very crucial question of the involvement of local government in these times, and in particular, when the issues of climate change impact the Caribbean so adversely, and mindful that the world economic situation, combined with the climate crisis, combined with the atrocities that is affecting, the atrocities that are affecting the global supply chain and making food a very expensive proposition and commodity for people in poorer countries like the small island developing states that largely comprise the Caribbean. And in these times, we are grateful to have champions. And probably the presidency offered by Spain at this very strategic time can present an opportunity for us to seek in Spain that champion that would have taken the baton from the July summit, the EU-LAC summit, and brought us to this stage. And mindful, too, of the institutional arrangements at the level of the EU, it is important, and I see around the table and among the participants, that we do have representation from the Committee of the Regions, and as well as very well represented here, the Federation of Spanish Municipalities. So within the institutional arrangements that of the core and the parliamentary diplomacy, as they call it in EU lingo, perhaps this is where our champions in the presidency and at the core can really advance the cause for local government. Mindful that we've heard the previous speakers this morning talk about the very prominent absence of local government in the declarations and even in other pronouncements emanating from the various EU levels. So these champions that are strategically aligned at this time, I would like to strongly advocate that we strategize with these champions to ensure that the local government agenda is advanced. Because we in the small island developing states are particularly concerned because of our circumstances relating to our vulnerability in these times of the climate emergency. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We'll move on to the next round. We are running slightly late, so I'd like to launch the following question, so that we don't just sit here and complain, but so that we can come up with concrete proposals. I'd like to ask you all, how could we move forward in a multi-stakeholder participatory and monitoring mechanism with this, for this renewed EU select strategy to be effective? Lily mentioned something, but I'd like to start off by Lily and continue with the rest of the panelists. And I'd ask you to be concise because we still have one more round of questions. Thank you. Well, I do have a concern that I'd like to express when we talk of local governments. Local governments, at least in my country, are made up by the mayor and a municipal council. And those sitting in the municipal council are the representatives of different political parties, including civil society. And as was in my case, when you are a minority in a municipal council, I never found the opportunity of gathering support to strengthen our citizens and to question what the municipality was doing and the municipal council, which was dominated by the party represented by the mayor. So, if we want a multi-stakeholder approach, we must take into account all of those organizations that of civil society that are participating in politics. We need to count on their dialogue because the population is calling for changes at a local level. It's not an easy question to answer. When we were discussing implementation, as we said, there was no mention or a very blurry mention to local authorities. As to the monitoring and follow-up and participation in the renewed strategy, firstly, I'd say we need to come up with a shared diagnostic. Specifically, we need the participation of all stakeholders that participate in cooperation between the two continents. It is true that things do not look good. We see that very often local governments are diluted into a large group named civil society in all of the documents we've read so far, when in reality, as my colleague mentioned, local authorities have a very complementary role to that of national governments. And then there's the issue of the private sector. the private sector has been given a dominant space in this strategy. So this raises some important questions. Indeed, the private sector is a necessary ally to meet the goals of this renewed strategy, but at the same time, among many of the challenges we are faced with, and this was said in the previous panel, we face with the challenge of protecting our common goods. And who is best placed than local authorities to do so? So this coming up with a shared diagnostic and the participation of all stakeholders when it comes to defining the goals and monitoring indicators is essential, I'd say. And one last thing I'd like to add is that we must work at a local or regional level as well, precisely to come up with a shared diagnostic and to engage local participants more. Given that Barcelona is a vibrant city and there are many events, a few days ago there was a meeting of European mayors that came out with an important declaration calling for municipalities to have greater recognition at a European level in all institutions, including the Committee of the Regions. And I think this is necessary before we move to discuss cooperation. Thank you so much once again. Let me be clear, there was only one mention to local governments in the declaration, but let's not get stuck on that. It's pointless that we recall time and time again that we are only mentioned once. Looking into the future, as I believe, and I think we all believe, what's important is that there can be a collaboration between the European Union and CELAC. So let's get working. Let's look at concrete collaboration projects without waiting the heads of state to take decisions. Those of us who are here, and many others, we should get working and move into action. What I would suggest is that one of the most immediate challenges for us should be to come up with collaborative projects so that we can learn from one another on how to manage things in different places, bearing in mind the needs. I'd suggest perhaps that for the coming months and years of this renewed strategy, there should be the possibility of having like an Erasmus program for mayors. I'd love a mayor from a municipality of a different country to be able to come here. When you ask for an Erasmus grant, you don't know what country you'll be sent to. Well, I'd love a mayor to be able to visit my city, and I'd love to be able to visit another municipality to learn from them. As I said, we share many of the problems and we'll very likely come up with similar solutions. So let's get working, let's end on a positive note with concrete goals, and let's get working. Thank you.
Oui, merci. Alors, au terme du forum de juillet, nous avons émis des recommandations.
Thank you. Yes, so after the summit in the month of July, after the recommendations, the authorities were calling upon the implementation of regulated mechanisms. This was not formally followed or seen. We called upon a meeting for 2024, but this is not enough because we need to establish this throughout time. This means that we need a structure. Or do we need to create a structure? Well, I'm not too sure about that. However, it is necessary for us to create regular mechanisms by which to have exchanges and assess the actions done. This is our interest as communities, as local governments, and it's fine that we're told that we are the closest to the citizens, and that's all fine and well, but sometimes we need to make sure of that. It's not always true. Sometimes, instead of local collectives, well, they're not too similar from one place to another. When we hear a colleague from Guatemala explaining a situation that has nothing to do with the organization of countries such as Spain or France. Therefore, we must be in that assessment process, and we need to ourselves assess what we do and the quality of what we do. As for the previous speaker, and regarding the need to be in more specific things, yes, I agree, because speeches are not enough. In my region, there is a cooperation agreement with the Maule region students, and we also work in more complicated projects such as oncology, exchanges of lecturers and professors in the departments of medicine, and these are specific things that are difficult to do because, you know, Chile and Bourgogne, there's quite different in Latin America and Spain. Well, there's some kilometers. And cost-related issues, how to do things. But if we truly want to, we can achieve it. We must be specific, yes. And regarding this Erasmus program proposal, the Erasmus program for politicians, this is something that the Committee of Regions is already talking about, but also the Erasmus programs for people, civil servants in the different groups, which I believe are important. This is something we can do. These mechanisms exist, but our administrations must be able to use them. At any rate, we need assessment and evaluation mechanisms, and this is what we defend from the Committee of the Regions.
Support of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, CLGF Caribbean, to the structural arrangements for implementation. We at the CLGF Caribbean level, we might be small in terms of population size. We represent close to 20 million people distributed around the Commonwealth Caribbean. But we also have within our arrangements the opportunity to reach those 20 million people, however they are distributed, through our local government national associations and councils representing about 600 districts. So if the investment by the EU, the money that the EU puts up in their regional MIPs, the 208 million euros are to be distributed in order that they reach the people, I think CLGF Caribbean, in the sub-region of the Caribbean, we are quite capable. And we offer you scalability. So you come to us, I would say, the EU can have its arrangements where through CLGF Caribbean, we can reach a large population of very vulnerable people, mindful that people live in communities. So we might have all kinds of interests, but at the end of the day, in order to reach people, we must find them and serve them in their communities. In addition to the way we are structured to deliver, we also have the support of the universities in the region, such as the University of the West Indies, with its range of disciplines from engineering to governance to gender equity that we tap into because our arrangements, the way our Constitution operates, we allow the participation by associate membership of the institutes of learning within the fold of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. So that is one means by which CLGF Caribbean can offer to lend support and to enable the real beneficiaries of these investments to have some kind of relief in many an instance. Coming to the Global Gateway, however, because of the scale at which I am led to believe that funding instrument is set up, it is very unlikely that small local authorities can benefit, because they're operating at a scale of more or less mega projects. But notwithstanding that, local authorities still stand to benefit, because if, as part of the monitoring and evaluation, even the criteria for awarding and entering into funding arrangements, as guardians of the interests of the people, there can be a mechanism that requires these investment projects of the Global Gateway to ensure that it contributes to local economic development in the areas where the Global Gateway is having its interventions, where those investments are based. So those localities where the Global Gateway is operating, from which the Global Gateway is operating its projects, there should be an evaluation criteria to determine that it contributes to the local economic development of the locality and its environs. So therefore, you build into it the element of corporate social responsibility. Secondly, because we are comprised largely of small developing states, land space is an issue. There might be an opportunity for Global Gateway investments, sadly enough, in the area of crematoria, because of shrinking land space and the availability of space for public cemeteries. There's now a growing need to shift towards the provision of crematoria for the disposal of the dead. And that might be an opportunity for investment. Additionally, we have issues with waste management, and that may also present an opportunity and offer the scale that you want in the area of solid waste, well, of waste management generally, the recycling aspects of it. But of course, these are areas that are to be explored, areas in which there has not been much of an intervention or investment as yet, but areas in which I envisage a great need. Thank you.
Yomar.
Bueno, importante que
It is important for us to provide a follow-up to all these conversations on the topics we're touching upon, but I believe we need to make the most of the technological capabilities that we have. Having events in person is fantastic, but we also need to take into account that twinnings and relationships are not only achieved internationally, it must be our own regions as well. And in these communities, what we need to take into account is these codes of thinking differently, and that we not always need to think alike, or only women or only men. That diversity precisely is essential and crucial. And in our case, in Ecuador, I don't know whether this happens or not in Europe, but there is a reduction of a municipal government and a local government. For us, a local government is wider, social fabric of environmentalist activists, young people, parish communities, municipalities, prefectures, men and women, and not thinking that the local government is only the municipal government. A local government turns into something that is alive whenever there is a relationship of all those different powers. And in that sense, in Ecuador, we did so in several cases of Ecuador Sin Ley, which are the participation systems, where not necessarily there need to be elected authorities. And if the law says that the president of that needs to be the president of the parish or the mayor, there needs to be dialogue possibilities open, because the sustainability or for those practices to not be rhetorical and be more practical as improving the quality of life, well, this requires that the people and the population is empowered with this type of different power relationships, power that is different to the classical power. Thank you very much, Yomar. So let's now go to the last round. We're going to be very disciplined and strict with time. Just tweet-like statement, please. I don't know how many characters now, but anyway, let's do a tweet-like statement or input. But this is very relevant. It is true that this renewed agenda is providing a response to this green, digital, and social agenda. Let's not forget that social transition has an autonomous and independent autonomy enrooted in those inequalities, and more than ever, the consistency of policies is necessary. We need to have public policies in a synchronized fashion acting, and that synchronicity and that interaction will be diverse, multiple, and very complex. And it'll be a key factor. Having political consistency will be key. So just a very swift round. This is the elephant in the room, but we need to tweet our answers. So what can we do to achieve that consistency in policies? We need to characterize more local governments in their composition and in their action strategies and in their relationship with central governments. This will allow us to truly focus where we're heading to or whom we're heading to. Twitter. Okay. Very complicated to tweet this, but anyway, I'd say to support decentralization process and local democracy process, to capitalize our practices, our achievements in the face of the accumulating challenges, and finally, a reference to a topic that was presented before, which is territorial cooperation. So, thinking beyond our administrative borders, because in the face of challenges, we need to also think about urban, rural, big and small municipalities. I thought what the colleague Jomas, what he said about municipal government and local government said is very interesting. That's very interesting, but I'm going to communicate my perception. It is true that some of us have been chosen or elected to represent the government of a city, but not only the 21 councillors in Azuqueca are the relevant people, because if you're not related to the entire society, and I repeat, the entire society, I like when children come to the city council to see me and I get this question, what does a mayor do? And what I always say is, mayors try for neighbors to be happy. This is what we must do not only with our neighbors, but as a result of this summit, this agreement, this renewed strategy, we need to convey and transfer this happiness to all our neighbors in Europe and CELAC, but also happiness and joy for all neighbors around the world. And finally, I would like to say that it is essential for us to share knowledge. Crucial. Otherwise, there's means nothing. We can have a lot of knowledge, but it's pointless if we don't share it. The question is difficult, and we truly cannot coordinate because one of the principles of decentralization is precisely freedom. The freedom of collectives to be administered as they wish. So we need to preserve this precisely. But the big trends make that big priorities are shared. The priorities of the European Union in terms of sustainable development, in terms of ecological transition, digital transition, obviously. This is present worldwide, so we need to find a way of articulating this that can preserve and respect the independence of each collective. Pushing those who are not fast enough in relevant areas to go a bit faster. How do we do this? Well, knowing the way in which we work a bit better. This is very relevant because we generalize and we establish averages. We are the best, but municipality in a country A or B do not have the same competencies, the same means. They all have different limitations regarding their scope of action, and if we don't know this, it's very complicated, including it in the framework of decentralized cooperation, which for me continues to be the most useful tool. So direct cooperations between two cities or two regions, as long as they are not limited to symbolic actions, which are also relevant, but they are not enough at the end of the day to make the population follow us and join us, because it is becoming increasingly difficult in this world to justify our fellow citizens, the fact that we're using their money to go to work with people and territories that are very far away. It's terrible that this is the case, but this is the case in Europe. The ideals of the far right here is something very relevant, and we need to show our fellow citizens whenever we do international cooperation that we're doing this for their well-being as well in their small territories and in our small territories. So we need to... I know this tweet is too long.
Well, if I were to tweet, I would have said that there's an urgent need for attention to be paid to the principles of good governance and the principles of decentralization. And in addition to that, we would require a level of decentralized cooperation among ourselves. And I would advocate strongly for a forum to be strongly reinforced, a forum that brings together local and regional authorities to ensure that the decisions of the summit take into consideration the views of local authorities and indeed local communities, mindful that at the level of the local authority, we engage the citizen-based organizations which encompasses civil society. Thank you.
Bueno, para la coherencia política creo que es...
For political consistency, I believe it is essential to say what we think and to do what we speak. So be more original, basically, because as elected authorities, governance is what interests us the most, but understanding this as conditions to finish our term. And let's not think that we don't need to leave relevant foundations for newcomers, and they need to agree upon things such as social justice, equality, gender equality. So I believe it is essential to be more original in politics. Thank you so much. It was very complicated. We had 6 speakers, so being respectful of time was difficult. So thank you so much. We are on time, so contributions have been very brief. We have some time for Q&A or for a debate, discussion. So it's your turn now to ask questions, make comments, and we have enough topics on the table so as to have a fruitful debate. So please raise your hands and introduce yourselves before you start speaking. So anybody wanting to speak?
Sí, adelante.
Yes, you have the floor.
Gracias. Muy buenas, gracias por vuestras.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your contribution. I'm Dolors Camats from the Foundation Catalonia Europe. I believe that you agreed with the previous panel on some reflections and bringing forward the need of the political role of city councils and not being just managers. There's a huge similarity there, which is also cross-cutting from the standpoint of territories, the size of municipalities, and whether we talk about local powers or networks or other organizations that are present here. It is also cross-cutting at a political level and at an ideological level of all the different ideas or political formations that have come here or are represented here in the elected personalities. So it has been properly identified that good part of the solution to challenges, constraints, and difficulties, the main goal, both locally and internationally, would be to provide a more significant political role to local powers, city councils, and municipalities. What is the hindrance there? I mean, if there's that cross-cutting similarity, if it's political and ideological, and it's similar to that of those who are governing other institutions, whether at a European level, state level, or regional level, if everything has been so identified, so much identified, that that greater role could be a solution to a better management, better trust, and to solving global and local problems, what is preventing us from doing this? Where is the problem? And this is a bit controversial, but I hope you can understand my comments and my question.
Como lo expuse,
The way I said it before, the problem is to see the local government as a sole unit and not looking at the different parts that make up that local government. Mayors do not or are not necessarily the representation of well-being or welfare for the population. Sometimes they are leaders that are brought from central government to be able to have more provincial councils and to consolidate their power further, not only in the executive power, but also the legislative power as well. So social organizations that perform advocacy for the local government are practically made invisible when we talk about the local government. As in other systems, as the colleague from Ecuador mentioned, in the case of Guatemala, we have a legal framework, which is all the system of councils for the development, where we have different representations to define policies from the local level to the national level. It has state-owned resources, but they are handled and manipulated by the people in power, in this case, the mayor or mayoress. So I believe that the problem lies in not making this different composition of the local government visible and variable in different countries. And this can truly empower true democracy and true citizenship of the population. Thank you. Yes, I would like to go into your provocation. That's how I've seen it, and I understand it, and it's good that we are doing this. So what is the obstacle there? I believe that one of the essential things is that we need to believe this. Municipalists need to believe this, because one thing is what we can say and a different thing altogether is what we're showing with our actions later. If we do not demand, if we don't truly ask our parties within our organizations, hey, this is what we were saying before. I have started by showing you a European program. Who needs to participate here at the end of the day? Can we make a decision on the reconstruction of municipalities in Ukraine? Well, yes, we can do that, but municipalities in Ukraine need to participate. So let's believe this. This is where the solution lies. Mr. Molinos? Yes, your question. Well, for me, the main obstacle would be the articulation between the needs of the states, even the European Union in this case. So a higher level for a series of standards with the local implementation. Both are necessary, and it's complicated because there's a power issue that lies behind. There's the question of subsidiarity and good articulation between the different levels, because there's obviously the need for common aspects in our countries, our regions. We also need those common aspects at a European level, but this common aspect should not crush the action capacity of the different municipalities. And this tension, or this permanent paradox, is almost the core or the heart of this democratic activity or exercise that is not experienced equally in all countries or on behalf of all citizens. My friends in Chile, some of them at least, tell me that the relationship of citizens in Chile with democracy is a fairly new relationship, and I'm talking about the regular citizen and not the citizen highly trained citizen. So our levels of appreciation of challenges are not the same depending on our democratic history, depending on the financial security or general security in our countries, because we cannot deny that there's physical or financial security is not the same. And if we're in Berlin, Paris, or some other countries in Latin America, this varies widely. So I believe that this democratic tension between the higher level that is necessary and the local level, well, this is what is precisely creating this tension and this difficulty. I don't know whether there's a simple answer to your question, but I would say this is dynamic.
Madame Pepin-Evole.
I don't know if Ms. Bertin would like to react. Yes, just a few words. I think this problem happens also in economic relations. The issue is, how can we shift out of a paradigm of competition among democratic authorities and move towards greater collaboration? That's what it's all about. The challenges we face today are huge. We have the far-right parties which are on the doorstep of many local and regional authorities in Europe. We have other extremist movements. Some democracies are at risk, and there's no more time to think in terms of competition. We have to think in terms of collaboration. There's a lot to be done. Each with our own competencies and skill sets can contribute to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, or otherwise we won't get anywhere. Some final remarks here? We're just getting the mic to you.
Perdón, aquí.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to fall into the provocation, and I'll forget about it, because if we fall into provocative reflections, we would be questioning the global governance architecture and how obsolete it is, because it's based on the interests of states that are obsolete when it comes to the social and development agendas we should be promoting. I could answer by saying that with all probability what is happening is that there is a great political fear at that level of government which manages multilateral relations. They fear other political representatives, the ones that you represent, to occupy this space. It's happened with feminist movements. If you give space to women, it's men who lose. If you give space to a local government, it's the national government losing space. However, I don't think we should look at it as a win or a loss. I think it's evolution. And at the same time, if we want to look at how we can overcome these interests that I mentioned before, I think that we may not have the same interests. I mean, macro political and macroeconomic interests are one thing, and they're leading to confrontation. I think what we need to define is what is our common agenda. And for that, we need an alliance between local and regional governments and territories, not just on both continents, but on other continents. We need to build bridges, and we need to come up with an agenda for new social contracts. And there we need to look at the role of local governments. I've been working in this for more than 20 years. All local governments support this. Whenever I meet a mayor or a member of a local authority, they truly support collaboration, but it's difficult to win this space. And the question now for the rest of this forum is, what agenda are we talking about? As the colleague said, how can we shift from being service providers towards a system of social services that protect the social contract? And in our perspective, and just to give some input for the future and the summit for the future of next year, I think we need a new social contract where services become care. And I think that if we articulate our agendas in Latin America and Europe, we'll be able to reach far. Any comments from the panelists before we conclude? No? Well, I'd just like to say that when I said we don't believe we can do it, it's not that we don't believe that we can do this. I mean, I'm sure mayors are extremely positive. I mean, the most you can aspire as an individual is to be the mayor of your town or city, right? Anyway, what I was trying to say is that when we are talking to our superiors, we have to convince them, and we have to say what we're saying here. Everything happens at a municipal and territorial level. We have a further request from the room. I'm Jairo Acuña. I'm the leader of governability in the PNB in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to react to the provocative words of our colleague at two levels. I agree with the comment made by Ms. Emilia in the sense that we are looking at governance as a political competition. And this doesn't make it any easier to come to agreements. I think we need to look at how we transform governance and take it beyond exercising power for the common good to understanding it as a system that will provide opportunities to the inhabitants in the communities and to encourage their development in a collaborative sense and not in a competitive sense. I don't want to share with you now what I was going to share tomorrow on the multi-stakeholder alliances, but when we look at the agenda, we think of the agenda, I think we need to look at how we'll be implementing this agenda. And I dare to say we already have an agenda, and the name of this agenda is the 2030 Agenda. Some may agree, some may disagree, some political and social actors disagree with some of the goals set forth in the 2030 Agenda. But instead of asking ourselves what our agenda is, we need to look at how we can land the 2030 Agenda at a subnational level and what role do we give to local authorities and governments so that they can speed up its implementation. Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone from the panel would like to react. And after that, I'd give the floor to Sonia Gonzalez for the conclusions of this panel discussion. Would anyone like to react? Ms. Papin? Well, I fully agree with you, indeed. Landing the goals set forth in the 2030 Agenda is essential, and the role of local governments for its implementation is very important. When looking at water, when looking at access to water, in decentralized cooperation projects, we have many, many concrete actions to respond to the needs that have been identified by our partners in our cooperation agreements. We need greater support from governments, from the EU, from the UN, to help us develop more concrete projects that can help reaching those goals in a very concrete way. Thank you. No one else wants to react? Sonia? Sorry, yes. Did you wish to add anything? Yes. No, I'd just like to point that the 2030 Agenda is an important framework for countries. Nevertheless, the 2030 Agenda would need to delve deeper into the deep gap that exists between the public and the private spheres. And there's the whole system of care, you know, the everyday lives of women, the infrastructure that do not help and that do not prevent violence against women. This is still a pending issue in the 2030 Agenda, and I think building this agenda to prioritize the lives of people, and more specifically the lives of people who have been marginalized like women, should be a priority in the 2030 Agenda. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. Well, I think we've had very interesting discussions in this panel, which I'm sure we'll be able to go deeper into in the next panel. We mentioned the importance of having an agenda that strengthens the social contract, or to have a renewed social contract. Mention was made to the need to have a shared diagnostic, and for this we need data, disaggregated data by territories. We also heard of the importance of having alliances within territories, not only among the public sector and civil society organizations, but also with the private sector. We need alliances among local governments and alliances with national governments, a triple alliance to continue strengthening governance, which, as one of the panelists said, is what makes it possible to come up with a new social agreement. Thank you all very much. Thank you also to all of the panelists who have participated in this roundtable, and let's keep up our discussions. Thank you.
Vamos a dar lugar.
We are now going to move on to the next discussion on the situation of human rights and citizenship rights. I will kindly request the next set of panelists to join me at the table. So for this roundtable, we will be discussing how can we reduce inequalities and better protect human rights of our citizens. These are elements that were touched upon during the inaugural speech and in other interventions as central points when looking at the agenda for the following years. These are very important aspects that affect the quality of democracy and the living conditions of many citizens. And the topic of today's discussion will be extremely important because the future depends on this. We will have Ms. Marta Nin, Director of Casa América Catalunya, Ms. Heidi Castillo, a human rights advocate from Nicaragua, Mr. Juan Pablo Muñoz, Director of the Tierra Nueva Foundation from Ecuador, Mr. Jacopo Suppo, Deputy Mayor of the Metropolitan City of Turin, Italy, and Mr. Felipe Muñoz Vallejos, who is the Mayor of Estación Central in Santiago de Chile. So while they take a seat, the discussions will be moderated by Ms. Marta Nin.
Adelante, pues.
So let's begin. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure sharing with you all and with the panelists of this roundtable. I'm very grateful with the Provincial Council of Barcelona for giving me the opportunity to participate in this forum. Casa América Catalunya is a foundation open to America, and one of the main lines of work focuses on human rights and historical memory, a culture of peace and gender perspective. All of our activities are aimed at generating critical awareness amongst our citizens. This afternoon, for the cultural activities, we have an activity, a literary route on the Latin American boom in the city of Barcelona. You're welcome to join it if you want. I'd like to start off by thanking Ms. Heidi Castillo and congratulating her on the award of the prize. It's awarded by the Provincial Council of Barcelona, and it recognizes her work defending civil, political, and social rights of the inhabitants of Nicaragua in a hard fight in a very unequal battlefield, which is more and more dehumanized and irrational. That is the government of Ortega Morilla. Thank you. We hope this award will renew your energy. We know that as many other citizens of Nicaragua, you've been stripped of your nationality. She now lives in the US. We have Sergio Ramirez and Yoconda Beni, who are here in Catalonia. In any case, we hope this award will give you renewed energy for your work. Thank you. Before being guillotined, Olympe de Gouges worked for the rights of women, which had been excluded from the first draft of the Human Rights Charter. She also fought for the rights of those who'd been enslaved, who weren't considered citizens at the time. Olympe de Gouges, before falling into the guillotine, said many things, but I'd like to remember one phrase. That woman who was born with an extraordinary emotion took inspiration from nature. Forgetting the virtues of her gender took her to the guillotine. I'd like to mention this because I'd like to maybe change some words and set them 2 centuries later in the current day situation, a situation that is sadly true for many human rights defenders. I guess the murderers think that human rights defenders are people with an extraordinary imagination that get instilled by these crazy ideas, dreaming about a more fair and society as if it was doable and potentially real, but forgetting the virtues of their conditions takes them to be murdered. According to the latest report by Global Witness in 2022, every 2 days a person was murdered while protecting the planet. 88% of killings happen in Latin America, and indigenous communities, although they only represent 5% of the population, are the ones that are being killed the most. At the other side of the data, we have that corporations that are exploiting or violating the principles of nature are usually the ones coming from countries like the US, Canada, EU, or China. Last week, 2 weeks ago in fact, I was able to participate in a panel on the future of the Amazon with scientists working in the region and with storytellers and photographers from indigenous peoples in the Amazon. Even if we imagine the Amazon as a big green space, and it is, most of the population is an urban population. The Amazon is full of cities, in fact, and they will be strategic points and key figures in meeting the environmental, economic, and social challenges of the future. It is often said that the Amazon is the lung of our planet, but 2 weeks ago, and thanks to participating in this panel and listening to the scientists, I understood it's the heart of this symbiotic system that governs our planet. When panelists were asked what the biggest challenge was in the region, each and every one of them answered that the biggest problem in the Amazon region, which, as you know, covers a large number of Latin American countries, was organized crime, or, in other words, the criminal economy. And this organized crime has also made its way into carbon bonds trade. It's dispossessed people of the rightful owners of the land to purchase and sell these bonds. It's a tool that was conceived to rebalance. Pollution is now leading to a new race for death and terror and plundering in the Amazon, and does not certainly contribute to finding a solution to climate change. One of the participants in that forum of the Tapara community of the Ecuadorian Amazon, I was impressed by her testimony. She said she didn't understand why we called her a defender of the land. She said all she wanted was to be able to continue living in her home on her land, and that the responsibility to defend the territory should be a collective struggle and shouldn't rest on the backs of indigenous peoples. I found that testimonial to be very revealing, not just because of her words, but because what it said about other populations that do not live in the Amazon, that live in cities. But maybe it's time for us to start to understand that we will have to start defending, fighting for, and protecting rights that we never imagined could be taken away from us. About a month and a half ago, I read an article on the city of Montevideo, where citizens are faced with a dire crisis of drinking water, which led to health problems accessing to safe drinking water. Also here in Catalonia, we have some small municipalities that during the summer months had water scarcity. These are problems that we could never have imagined happening. So the environmental crisis and the human rights crisis calls on us to not only look at faraway territories, but also to look at the daily lives in our cities. The proposal for this roundtable is to discuss human rights and open up a dialogue between the different levels of commitment between the European Union, CELAC, and I'm especially looking at the local government's perspective. It'll be a difficult discussion. There is no easy solution. The simplified solutions that are never simple, and we'll try overcoming this complexity and to discuss human rights. I'd like to start off asking a first question, or two questions rather. You can pick whether you want to answer both questions or just one of them. Why do you believe it's necessary to recover a human rights approach in the bi-regional relations between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean? And how do you believe local governments can contribute to strengthening the full exercise of human rights and freedoms in a general context where human rights are often denied? I don't know who'd like to start first. You? Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the Provincial Council of Barcelona for organizing this dialogue on very important topics. I am here to greet you on behalf of the Metropolitan City of Turin, and I'm also here as the mayor of a small village in a valley in the Alps near Turin. In Italy, we have horrible laws at a municipal level. You can only be in the Metropolitan City of Turin representing if you're elected member of a smaller town. It's a problem for many of us in Italy. I'm delighted to be here to discuss a very important topic in our territories. I'd like to share my thoughts on citizens' rights. The Metropolitan City of Turin is the largest in Italy. It's the metropolitan city where we have 312 municipalities. We have very small towns and very large cities represented in the metropolitan city. And the challenges we work on every day are to combine the many differences in the different territories. I think the main challenge is to ensure public services, health, education, public transport in the city of Turin, but also in the smallest town in the furthest away valley of the metropolitan city of Turin. It's a way of working for our citizens to leave no one behind in public discussions. This is a huge responsibility. Many citizens in Italy do not trust the state, do not trust politics. The public transport doesn't work, schools don't work, healthcare is in a complicated situation. And these are the main concerns of many families and citizens. So if we want to work to engage in a positive dialogue between local elected representatives and citizens and state institutions, when we talk of aspects that have to do with people's lives, we have to take it very seriously. And I think this is the first challenge we are met with. It's the first problem that we have to bring up when we discuss with the regional government and the national government. We need to build trust among the territories and among the citizens who have their needs and who have the right to receive the same level of service. Thank you. As a mayor of my Estación Central in Chile, I guess the context and the city you represent is very different from the one mentioned by Mr. Supo. Do you also believe we need to build trust? It's essential. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to be part of this forum and sharing this panel with you all. It's a great pride for me. I was thinking of the initial question, why do we need to recover a human rights approach? And we have to do this to avoid what happened in my city a few years ago. We have a council member of Santiago, and we have Francisco Pinochet, who's the mayor of Chile, who's the one managing the money. So I'm sure they'll understand what happened to us in our town. Before I answer the question, I have to give you some background. For 4 or 5 years ago, our municipality started seeing high-rise buildings being constructed that should never have been constructed. They realized that these buildings were illegal. There were more than 100 buildings, high-rise buildings, which meant that we went from being a city of 120 to a city of 230,000 people, and this has not yet been picked up on the census. So with the same municipal facilities, we now have to provide services to a much larger population. We are lacking 3 medical centers. We are lacking 10 kindergartens. We need more police forces. So it's not just a problem in terms of municipal facilities, but it led to problems with access to healthcare. We have frequent power cuts. We also always refer to our municipality as a part that has been sacrificed in favor of the city, and our mayor is working to revert the situation, to grow more, to build more municipal facilities, and for that we need resources. And we need to realize how we must move forward in a municipality that was totally devastated. At the same time, this increase in population comes hand in hand with issues relating to migration, which our country is no exception to. We've had many people migrating to Chile from Venezuela, and they also live in these high-rise buildings. Also here in Barcelona, the Smart Cities event, they refer to them as vertical ghettos. Just for you to realize, it's like a nest building, a beehive building in Hong Kong. In a block of less than 200 square meters, we have 20,000 people. We are talking of buildings with more than 180 flats, 17 square meter flats that were designed for 1 person, but you have 8 people, so it's hugely overcrowded. In our municipality, what happened was that public policies were designed without thinking about human beings. They prioritized the interests of the real estate agencies through a law that was passed by the previous mayor. And that's what led to this savage construction of these high-rise buildings. So how can we revert the situation? What can local governments do to strengthen human rights? Well, in our case, we need to build more infrastructure. For that, we need more coordination with the central government. And we need coordination between the municipality and the institutions. We need a new migration office to support our new neighbors. We have serious difficulties in catering to the educational needs. We need more schools. And when it comes to kindergartens and schools, primary schools, we need more of them, because schools are a place for the integration of migrant people. Schools act as a space to integrate citizens. But the situation was made very complicated. We've seen an increase in population, and the healthcare facilities are stretched. We see a growing number of population, and very often in our city there is a lack of medical facilities, and there's surging levels of insecurity, which is blamed on migrants, and this generates gaps and generates xenophobia, and ultimately it's the city government that has to tackle this. So I'd say that it's extremely necessary to have a human rights approach, and we need to include this human rights approach in our municipal structure. And when we look at the programs put in place, we need policies that last long in time and that don't change depending on the different governments at each time. Thank you. Thank you so much, Heidi.
How can local governments to contribute to the full exercise of human rights? Well, thank you to the Barcelona Provincial Council for providing me with this opportunity of sharing with so many authorities from our perspective, from the perspective of the territory, of citizens, of women, and human rights. I've recently come from an experience where the local government was virtually turned into a small box of central government and a place where political violence of the state is supported, which is ordered from the very national level to be executed at the local level. So, when reading the questions for the panel, I thought to myself that we have to be self-critical, collectively speaking, of what we are understanding when we say local government or local development or human rights. And I thought that the first thing would be to think that without citizenship, there's no territory. And neither do we have a territory without a citizenship. And if we don't have citizens or territory, what are we going to rule? Going now to your responsibilities, because I've never held a public position, you are temporary administrators of public things. And authorities are something transient, and what remains the most is people. So therefore, and along those lines, I believed it was important to understand territory as a place where not only there is economic dynamism, but it is also a place or space for coexistence, human relationships, and people. People who have dreams and needs and potentialities. Sometimes it is believed that territory is that space where we pick our clients from, our votes for electoral processes from. We need to stop thinking that the role of the local government, it is basically to only clean our parks and collect our waste and provide us with infrastructure. And we need to start thinking about how to guarantee freedom, how to guarantee rights, participation, opinion. How do we plan together, authorities and communities, all the development that is necessary and not just the activities? How do we split the budget and the wealth? And when we talk about human rights, it is even concerning that we're asking the question, why are we governing for it if it's not for a full exercise of human rights, the dignity of people? And in this sense, I thought it was very relevant to say, as this advocate was saying in her introduction, sometimes civil society, women organizations, indigenous people, we are seen as the enemy. There's even some places where advocates are killed and all our rights are taken away from us until we almost suffer a civil death. In order to have a bottom-up freedom, we need to be seen as allies in order to achieve that fulfillment. Otherwise, the organizations of civil society, community organizations, are very close to the people, and we can provide an extraordinary contribution to humanize politics and local development. And I believe that it is also very important to change the way in which we measure local development. We should rather measure how peaceful our coexistence is between our communities, whether we're eating our 3 meals, whether women are being capable of giving birth to their children under safe conditions, whether girls are attending school and not staying home, covering for the needs of the house, or whether the territory or the population is leaving the land and going to the US, because in some time, and the way things are happening, local governments will have nobody left to govern. In Central America, we believe we need to turn things around and not forget where we're coming from. Our collective memory. We come from wars in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and we've already forgotten about peace agreements. So we're going back to conceptualizing, and I don't want to extend myself. We need to be short in our answers, but I would like to say that when Central American presidents and male presidents back in the time, when they signed the Alliance for the Sustainable Development after the peace agreements, they conceptualized the process as a change that was going to be progressive in terms of the quality of life of the human beings. And this is what we should ask ourselves now. We should measure it. How much of all that have we achieved? And not rather thinking whether, as the Councillor for Guatemala was saying, how many votes that party had in that specific municipality, but rather how much history was created together between government and the community so that nobody has to leave the community to find a living in the US or coming to Europe on a trip with the chain of human rights violations. So we need to change the concept of territory, the concept of governance, and the concept of how we're doing public policy and local policy. Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, it is no doubt relevant to have construction of public policy from the standpoint of human rights, especially taking into account the context we have referred to, the context of deep inequalities and gaps generated globally and experienced locally. We cannot necessarily respond from the local context to the impacts of climate change that take place from a more generalized context by corporate stakeholders or national states. In the case of Ecuador, we are close to living the impacts of the El Niño phenomenon, which is precisely caused by that global environmental situation, but we need to respond locally. And I'm giving you this as an example because it turns out that national governments in Ecuador, before the phenomenon of El Niño, having this competency, risk management at a national level, they turn to local governments and they ask them to be in charge. So they transfer the social pressure and this phenomenon onto the resourceless local governments. And I'm saying this because in order to have a guarantee of our rights, to recognize the role of the states in the different levels of governance and what is happening specifically in our specific scenarios, we are experiencing violation of rights and a weakness of the state in its different layers as stakeholders that must guarantee those rights. The colleague who is the mayor of Rosario is not here, but there are some positions, such as the one seen in Argentina by the candidate Milei, which precisely makes this position before the government as extreme in the sense of the role it has to precisely face these inequalities and to redistribute wealth and to guarantee rights. But that's what we have. So we have in this very recent period experienced the return of this more neoliberal logics, the weaknessing of a state and the transfer of those resourceless competencies to local governments, that decentralization. Our colleague talking about decentralization, well, I'm sure there's been some other cases, but it's concerning as well that this is unloaded, these social competencies are unloaded on resourceless local governments. So we need to look for the guarantee of rights and redistribution of wealth. The approach of the welfare state, well, we need to recover that. And in the case of the Andes, well, the well-living or well-being state, we share with the Caribbean colleagues this view of our ancestors, including this long-term view of protecting nature, because we speak about individual rights, collective, social, and financial rights, but also nature. It allows us to have a long-term perspective. But if that is not up and running and we're walking backwards and weakening that role of the state at the different levels, how can we guarantee rights? How can we move forward to greater equality and equity? So I believe this is very much related to the understanding that has been already mentioned. What do we mean when we say local government or local power? Because it is not only the municipal government, it's the concurrence of different levels of government, but also social participation of citizens that make up what's public. Sometimes we think about participation as a limit to that building of power in a municipality, and that entails providing some space so that differences and different stakeholders in society express themselves, including peoples and nationalities which are essential. Ecuador is declared as a plurinational state of rights and justice. Sometimes jurists say, well, is it not rights? Well, precisely looking for that constitutional guarantee, which is the democratic and legal basis of the state. Let's see if that is met. Not much, is it? But the declaration is there, and we need to recover the state of a plurinational state of rights. And recovering the question, but giving a bit of a context to what has been said here, I believe it is essential to have cooperation and recognition of the role of local governments and the dialogue Europe-Latin America, obviously. But we need to avoid running the risk of that agenda entailing exchanges in the double way, of course, bidirectionally. It's not that we want to learn more from Europe and receive funding. We want to teach as well. There's important things related to social participation, food sovereignty, and, well, this such interesting topic after the pandemic. If we don't learn that we need not only security but food sovereignty, we have a very concerning future. There's a lot to propose from Latin America, and these topics of solidarity economy. Maybe Europe can learn something from what we're doing in local governments and civil society with some topics, and the other way around as well. There's a lot we can learn, and we need support in local governments in South America and the Caribbean with Europe. But if all this importance, and I'm already closing up, it is essential to not only have that construction and exchange agenda between Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, but also proposing a political agenda in the face of all these global issues. What do local governments say and civil society say in the face of those inequalities, concentration of wealth? That's not something local, it's global. So there should be a positioning of some sort to find ways of overcoming that situation of huge inequality and violence, because that inequality is leading to wars that are genocidal, and we need to express ourselves in the face of what we're living in the world at the moment. We will very likely need to assume, well, we need to place this in the global agenda, yes, but we also need to dispute the national scenario. If we don't have a political proposal towards the recovery of the welfare state or moving towards the well-living state, as people say in the Andes, how can we guarantee rights? States that are not concerned about this. I thought the difference between interests and values was very relevant. If the concentration of income and wealth is the only concern, they won't be concerned about facing social rights and economic rights. So we also need to dispute this at a national level, otherwise we won't be synchronized. We say collaborate, but if the central government is moving along different lines and is not concerned about rights, even or including nature rights, it is very difficult to have that synchronicity, because that proximity government is receiving pressure, but it needs a response from central government. And obviously, and with this I finish, and it's been said here, and I think it is essential to think about the exercise of the government, always with social citizen participation, social control to the management of the resources, because people have the right to know how their money and taxes spent.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much. I would ask you, Felipe, in Estación Central, there's a security problem. It's a problem that has also stemming from construction, totally unprecedented construction, given the urban new policy, also as an outcome of a migration that has come from a geopolitical situation in Venezuela. Almost 7 million people from Venezuela have been moving all around the continent. So there's lots of different planes that all somehow are united in the lack of security in your city. So the question would be, how can we move forward so that this safety perspective is also focused on human rights? How can security and safety be provided to citizens and also from the guarantee of the human rights? That's a very interesting question, because the issue in Chile, not just my municipality or the metropolitan region, but the entire country, public safety is something very relevant. There's no other topic that is in the media so much. The media showing different situations. In this particular case of Estación Central, is nothing new, because my municipality, well, we're receiving new people, so everything happens first in Estación Central. So recent things are extortions. There's a sector in our municipality, a place where there's lots of buildings, and it is coexisting with an old neighborhood, high concentration of new neighbors, and there's blackmailing and extortion to people who have commercial shops and venues, and there's been several already with this feeling of fear. Our municipality is called Estación Central because of the central station, train station. So there's also the Evangelic Cathedral. It has 2 malls, big shopping malls. And there's around 9 million people monthly. There's Alameda, the main street in the region and entire Chile, with 5 metro stations. So fluctuating population, and the people that arrive do so because of the strategic location. I feel very proud to say that when you come to a town and live in Central Station, you can be elsewhere in 40 minutes because you're in a strategic place. And based on the huge gap of safety, there were 4 patrolling vehicles in terms of safety, then that's very few for the amount required. And we have 25 now, so very significant leap there. And huge coordination as well with the police, authorities, and the private entities collaborating a lot. And in Chile, precisely now, the law of public safety is under debate, bringing along new responsibilities for municipalities. So very frequently we see those attributions, greater responsibilities, and this is not accompanied by resources. So with the same resources municipalities have, they need to focus on this. And this is also of a very punishable nature, because everything that happens in the street means, well, get rid of all the paperless migrants or undocumented immigrants. And however, we recognize that as a municipality, we need to move along different lines, tackling this issue from its complexity. We cannot have solutions that are simply conformant with those things. We need to look at the background of problems. And we are very proud to have a vertical community program that allows us to have territorial development and community development within these communities, bringing the municipality closer to coexistence programs, culture programs, to the new neighbors in our town. So I believe this has been a right thing to do with a multidisciplinary team. Whatever we had in our towns, we are now going to do in our communities that bring all these issues closer to the municipal offer. And this has been very important, together with the increase of equipment, perfecting coordination. But community is very important for us. The main issue that we have, and with this I finish, is that most of the safety and security problems that we have are not offenses, and killings have increased as well, but it's a problem with coexistence, like noises, people who are bothering other people, people abusing drugs and alcohol and out in the street, people just using music or dancing to music out of the buildings. So, well, you know, this is Chilean culture, but we're a bit more boring than that in Chile, so that we have that cultural shock, which is become a safety problem, but we consider it a coexistence problem, and we need to work together with the communities in order to establish a culture of respect and mutual acceptance and understanding that the town is different, it's new, and we need to all work together. However, for the human rights advocates, safety here is something totally different. How do you believe we can contribute to have a safe environment for the exercise of rights or to defend rights? And that would be a question for Aide, but you two could also answer later. Yes. I believe that this is one of the most essential topics if we talk about human rights, because insecurity is precisely the antithesis of what we are seeking, which is basically that people can feel safe, that we can live our daily lives with fulfillment and without feeling threatened. And in the present day, the situation of Central America is excessively concerning. We are talking about a region that is somehow governed by organized crime, by human trafficking. Daily, I was looking at the media today and the amount of women and girls that have disappeared and are being negotiated within that trafficking. Also, trafficking with weapons and drugs. All this is the perfect hotspot for political violence, and in all its different shapes. In the home, families, districts, homes. And I can speak of Nicaragua here, the states. Instead of thinking about the safety of people, we have gone back to the 50s, 60s, 70s of the military dictatorships, where the priority was the safety of the state. And unfortunately, I wish it were the state as theoretically conceived in the case of Nicaragua. The dictatorship couple here is the state, the institutionality, the law, everything. So all safety resources are aimed at protecting this dictator family in power. And in this sense, I believe that we need to change this conception and start thinking about giving back this security and safety, thinking about the people, their dignity. As stated by the principles of human rights. And another thing here is that we want to have more budget for the army and police forces. We want to have more or increased budget for repression. And I was reading once again that when the peace agreements were signed, it was stated the idea of building a new safety model in Central America was going to be established on a reasonable balance of forces. So let's ask ourselves what is happening now with the presence in the region of China, Iran, Korea. That correlation is changing as well. I was talking about the new model of security, of strengthening civil power, thinking once again that the military power needs to be subordinated to the civil power. But it is also talking about overcoming poverty, sustainable development, livelihoods, responsible livelihoods, eradication of violence, eradication of corruption, terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapon trafficking. So how far have we gotten regarding all this? We very quickly forgot about war, about the conflicts we come from. We lost our memory. And very likely the only thing we had was a change of stakeholders from those times of groups and military rights to a situation where the main stakeholders, well, let's look at who decides on the politics of community of a town. It is oftentimes organized crime, and all local governments are overwhelmed by a factic power. Nobody chose or elected, but there are lots of policies sustaining this imposed power, these factic powers. And then finally, I would like to say that we need to turn the concept of safety around. We need to go back to the communities, to the values in the communities. I remember where we live, how nice it is when the community takes care of itself, when we have communication with the police authorities, like peer-to-peer communication, those moments when organizations of women were sitting down with the police officers trying to find the killer together, a killer who'd killed his wife and the children, but it was joint efforts trying to get rid of all the mines at the border with the army, with the police. All this has been forgotten. And today, we are seen as enemies. And the legal framework of counterterrorism and security has been used to make us criminals. When I left Nicaragua, I'm not the only one, by the way. Out of the few millions there, many have fled. And I remember I was in despair, afraid, crossing the entire country to save my life. And I was wondering, how come that true offenders and criminals stay in Nicaragua, and we are the ones who have to flee our own land?
Today in Nicaragua, more than 10% of the economically active population unfortunately has had to go to Costa Rica, US, Spain, and other countries, living in truly deplorable conditions. We're not always well received in the countries we migrate to. So I think local governments must take action together with citizens. We have to turn the situation around, and we can no longer allow the security forces of the dictatorship and the criminal groups to take over and replace what security for people and for human beings and for girls should truly be about. Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. Well, in the case of Ecuador, the biggest problem affecting our citizens, and it's proof of the reality we live, is that of insecurity. You know, recently we held elections in the country. One of the candidates to president was murdered, but before then they'd already murdered local authorities. In Manta, there was a murdered mayor. In Duran, they tried killing the mayor. The situation of insecurity is terrible, and it's a major preoccupation and worry when you talk of politics and government. And as Heidi rightly said, very often this has been used to strengthen and heighten the repression of the state. They don't only use it to attack the criminal organized crime, but they also use it to break down on civil society and the rights of peoples, indigenous peoples and women. And this also happens in Ecuador, strengthening the repressive forces. The state has given up on its duties, and since they cannot meet the expectations of the citizens, they repress citizens. And I agree with Heidi on the need to reconsider the way we look at security and look at it as a way of defending life. And this can be done if local governments stand side by side with the citizens, the women, the local communities, even if security is very often in the hands of the central government. But in some places, we manage public spaces. If you fill these public spaces with life, if you are able to strengthen the social fabric through culture and sports, you will be giving the community with the tools to respond to this insecurity. But it means for this to happen, we have to change the way in which we are responding to organized crime. And let's hope that having social organizations and local governments coming together will help us to come up with new policies and to put an end to the repression being exerted by central governments. One last comment in relation to what has been said on public policies. Public policies usually try overcoming or resolving the consequences of a problem, but not the underlying causes. That is why we have to tackle the root causes of the problems. Thank you so much. Would you like to make a comment? Talking after Madame Castillo is never easy. I'd like to thank her for her words and her courage. Thankfully, in Italy, we are not faced with the issue of public insecurity. We do face a problem of social security, however. And this is so because there are many Italians who cannot access public services, and there are many people living in Italy who are not Italian nationals. And here we go back to the issue of migration. There are many people living in Italy, and the open question is that they don't feel represented by politics. We have a whole series of laws in Italy that weren't developed to contribute to people living and having a fruitful life in Italy. And this isn't fair. I think everyone should have the right to choose where they want to build their lives and their futures, or where they want to make their dream come true, or to stay next to their families. However, in Italy, we see generations of people who are born in Italy and who have Italian friends and go to Italian schools, but who are not Italian on paper. These are different communities, and they have, unfortunately, different rights. And I think the main problem is that in the future we may see people who are in Italy but who feel they do not belong to the community. And this poses a huge problem in terms of social cohesion. Local governments are the only ones who have come up with attempts at fostering a greater social cohesion policies and inclusion policies, especially with the younger generations at school, but it's very difficult because we do not have laws that have been developed to facilitate this. We are lucky, however, because there are many citizens that are actively working for social inclusion and for cooperation and collaboration, but that's not enough. Unless we have national legislation that gives towns and villages and cities the ability to develop these policies, it won't be enough. We want to increase cooperation and collaboration among countries from the European Union and from Latin America and the Caribbean, but we also want to strengthen cooperation with African countries. We have an important issue in the Mediterranean with all the political problems happening in many African states. We have to tell our national governments that they have to stop with these policies of collaboration with African governments. We need instruments to work together and to work with people from other countries. Thank you. Thank you so much. With Milagros' permission, I see she's looking at me, but there was one point we hadn't discussed yet, which I think is very important. At least I'd like one person to answer. Cities are totally engaged in the green transition, but the paradox is that what this green transition is doing is encouraging the plundering and exploitation of naturally protected areas. So as part of the EU LAC strategy, one part has to do with promoting sustainable development and energy interconnectivity, climate adaptation, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. How can we do all this? How can we actively contribute to the type of development we would need whilst also protecting the ecosystems for our planet to continue breathing and working as an integrated system? There's a paradox, it seems to me. There's demand put on cities, but we, at the same time, we continue to plunder natural resources and keep them for ourselves. So how can this bi-regional relations find a way out of this whole situation? I think that one of the biggest issues we are faced with in Chile, and I guess it's true for Latin America, and I'd even go as far as saying it here in Europe too, is that municipalities have different levels of competencies. We are talking about this with the head of the municipalities division, Francisco Pinochet. Don't mistake his surname. Francisco is a great person. It's a problem because when it comes to working on certain issues, some municipalities have more resources and more capacities. Others are far from being able to draft a proposal and don't have the technical capacity. The same applies to when it comes to prioritizing topics. We firmly believe that rather than having a greater standardization, I mean, I imagine we all believe and agree that we should strengthen municipalism through associations so that municipalities can have greater skill sets. But I'd also say that in the case of Chile, it's very important for the priorities to be clearly written down on paper. If you don't have a written law, there is no obligation. So all of this has to be translated into the municipal structure, and it can maybe come hand in hand with a program of incentives to leverage public and private resources better, because very often we need greater resources to deal with issues that affect our communities. Very briefly, in the case of Ecuador, I'd say it's important to say, perhaps some of you already know, that together with the electoral process, there was a popular consultation on the Yasuni area for oil exploration in the area. The company TNC had already started extracting oil because they'd invested in the infrastructure, but 70% of the population said no more oil exploitation. By this, I'm trying to say that social citizen participation is also essential when it comes to defining public positions. We've had consultations on the Ande and Choco, where the population decided to stop mining activities in a sensitive area. In the Pichincha community, we have the mayor of Cotacachi, though also territorial local consultations to stop mining activities, and also in that case, some local governments have understood on how important this is. So I think local governments need to rely on environmental groups and citizens that are showing what we should consider when discussing the relations between the EU and Latin America. I'm sorry to interrupt your interventions because they're really interesting. We could discuss about them further, but I hope that in the public discussion now, if you have anything more to say, you can say this. So we will open up the discussion. I see one request for intervention, 2, 3. We'll take the question at the back first.
Ahora sí.
Vale.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm José Amparo Medina, District Director for International Relations from Bogota. In past 4 years, Bogota has developed a response to the challenges in terms of the realization of human rights based on the concept of caring for people to meet the conditions that enable caring for democracy, because democracy is what generates the conditions to take care of our planet. And I think behind this narrative we have some very powerful facts that can be shared, and that's why I want to mention them here. What do we understand by caring for people? Well, this has to do directly with the opportunities we give to everyone, especially women and youth, for them to develop their true potential so they can join the labor market, have a profession, but also self-care and to take space to breathe. Especially in the case of women, very often they dedicate a disproportionate part of their lives to care for others, their children, elderly people when there's no social security, people with disabilities. This limits their opportunities, but also for the young and for migrants. I believe local governments hold a great responsibility in providing opportunities that are based on solidarity. We need territories of solidarity when faced with human mobility. I was telling my colleagues, it's striking that when in the first panel, when we announced the challenges of our times, we didn't mention human mobility. It's a global drama. There are mafias, there's organized crime, exploiting. People do not leave their families and land and homes out of pleasure. They do so because the conditions lead them to leave. So, for cities as a place for opportunities, shouldn't just bring opportunities for the inhabitants of the city, but for those come to the city seeking for a better life. I didn't want this to go unnoticed. We need opportunities, but we need justice and security. The weight of impunity in regards to the situation of security in Latin America is huge. That is why we need to do work with our states and our congresses to strengthen security measures and justice. They are an essential condition for democracy. We are seeing a surge of regimes that are good at banning security and take away our citizens' dignity. So it's an important discussion when we talk of democratic processes where cities are privileging, putting justice above human rights. And this is closely linked to climate change commitments taken on by states. It's a costly thing from a political, fiscal and financial perspective for our states and our cities. And I think any cooperation, collaboration and global solidarity with a part of the world that has such important social natural resources as Latin America should be part of the agenda. So, my question to the panelists, how do you, from your fields of expertise, how can local governments include the care perspective in meeting their agendas? Thank you. Who from the panel would like to answer? Zaide? Thank you very much for sharing this beautiful experience with us. What we learn from this is that many things can be changed, as we've heard through your testimonial from Bogota. Now, the issue of security must look at where the responsibility for caring for life lies. And in today's development model, the role of care is too often carried by women. Who's taking care of the rivers of people who are leaving their kids behind? It's grandmothers. They are left to bring up their grandchildren. They don't have the same energy they had when they were mothers. They have no social security. In Nicaragua, only 20% of people have access to social security. And most of those living in rural, semi-rural and indigenous territories do not have social security. And those are the areas where people are coming from in greater figures. So it's very important for local governments to take on, and I say we should take on, I don't see the local government just as a mayor with a group of councillors, but rather the mayor, the councillors, together with the indigenous governments that may exist in those territories, and together with ourselves, the citizens' representatives, should do this. So the care economy must be taken on by all of us. At the end of the day, who is benefiting. I mean, for many of us to be here, who cleaned, ironed, cooked, and prepared our hotel rooms? We have to think of these everyday things. And since we don't have much time, I'd like to link this question to the relationships with the EU. Maybe we won't have much time to discuss this, but I'd like to say that recently I was in this summit between the European Union and CELAC, and we went there because we were told that the agenda, we left because they said they wouldn't be discussing human rights. It wasn't on their agenda. That's what we were told. They said the topics on the agenda was green and energy transition. And we said this simply cannot be, but we went there nevertheless to express our concerns from Central America, Latin America, Nicaragua. And in this sense, I think we need a change in our relations between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean. The relations are very much a top-down vision. It's as if I'm teaching you, there's nothing for me to learn from you. But when we look at the economic relations, I don't want a European Union that is only interested in our raw materials. The free trade agreement, we were offered a strategic partnership agreement between the European Union and Central America. And they said, no, no, it'll be totally different from the North American free trade agreement. We were excited. They said it'd have a pillar on trade, yes, but it'll also have a political side to it and cooperation. The negotiations ended, and only the trade part of the agreement was implemented, and we were left waiting for the other two components. And in the EU summit, the participation of civil society wasn't at all what we expected. You can give your opinion, but when you look at the EU strategy, this renewed EU strategy, and when we look at what we are discussing here, nothing of what we're discussing here is part of that strategy. We're not the enemy. We share a common history, and in that common history, I think we have to revisit many elements, including the issue of extractivism. You cannot have human rights in places with mining activity. It's impossible. Our rivers, our land is drying out. The indigenous populations, rural communities are being kicked out of their land to make way for mining. We need to allow people to stay in their land and live in dignity. And we need to look at what we can contribute. There's much we can contribute to you and much you can contribute to us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There is another question here and two more over here. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Irene Caras, head of a team of public administration and social issues and citizenship in FIAP. I would like to, more than a question, make a comment during this panel. We've seen different experiences of cities and the different difficulties and hindrances that exist in the exercising of human rights by citizens, both in Latin America and in Europe. But we all know that the acquisition of Latin America and Europe of rights has been done differently. This makes us think about the meaning and the sense of human rights in each one of the regions in Latin America, for instance. And particularly, we need to stress the presence of indigenous communities and ethnic minorities that have historically claimed the guarantee of human rights, without forgetting their conditions of cultural diversity and asymmetry as compared to the dominant Western culture. The reference document for all continues to be the Universal Declaration for Human Rights of the UN of 1948, but it cannot start and end there, as seems to be the case. What brings us here together today is a reflection on human rights, and it's linked to the current concept of citizenship. The new challenges, the moral rights and duties and financial and social, which are also very paramount in the current discussion on our democracies. So from this and in the framework of the new strategy, Latin America, European Union, the approach must be how to jointly build or construct a citizenship within a globalized context that can guarantee respect and promotion of rights, rights that must be inclusive in terms of social and economic context that needs to contemplate culture, negative impacts of climate change, and essentially rights that have a gender perspective. As the representative from Uruguay was saying this morning, this is something that is at most fundamental given the gaps between men and women we cannot continue to ignore. Therefore, the role of municipal governance is key, and although this has been repeated, the opportunity of the 2030 agenda, well, we need to make the most of it. The location of the implementation of the agenda is important, and as Leila was saying this morning, in Spain, the new Cooperation Act believes municipalities are key for cooperation, key stakeholders for cooperation. I would like to talk about what we do from FIAB in terms of institutional strengthening and accompaniment to start up public policies, capacity building of civil servants, and the promotion of rights of citizens, social cohesion that, in the end of the day, have as a consequence a guarantee and application of human rights. And this is my contribution. Thank you so much. It has been a comment and a reflection that has no question for the panel. Let's hear from the two people who had asked to pose a question. Thank you so much. I only wanted to add up to the reflection. So in the case of Latin America, and particularly in the case of Guatemala, how come the situation is of such a great inequality and such a big gap for the consecution or achievement of human rights? We've heard new terminology that characterize new characters. The level of migration in the country is such towards, well, mainly the US, that there's now a term which is called white widow, existing in populations with a high level of white widows, because a white widow means that the partner migrated and they depend on whatever income the family can contribute, and they represent the second or third position of national income for the country. So this is just to characterize the great challenges that we have ahead in what can be considered as a priority in the green transition when the human rights of people suffer from this great gap. And let's not talk about human rights of women. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jimena Yemin. I am a Mapuche council of an indigenous town in Santiago de Chile, Peñalolén. Well, thank you for the opportunity provided by the mayor, Carolina Leitao, of my municipality, president of the Chilean Association of Municipalities. I want to continue reflecting on the work that is done where states cannot reach. In those places, local governments are reinvented, and we've heard different cases and policies that have good outcomes, I want to use testimonials as a reflection, because as was said in the first panel, local governments and the city councils are there in the first line, listening to all testimonials. And when we talk about human rights, we use global terms, but also particular terms, those that provide us with dignity in the life we choose to have or the life that we wish to have. And we come from a pandemic that has left complex situations in terms of mental health of citizens. And I want to reflect on a healthcare policy that, although in existence in my country, the municipality of Peñalodena has had to promote it, which is exiting drug abuse. When we did this work with a group of people who were leaving abuse behind, such as alcohol abuse, a woman asked, "When did you decide to leave the situation behind?" And she told me that her psychologist called her and asked her how she was, and she said, "Well, I'm here. My son is coming. He's in the military service, and I'm very scared because I don't know if I'm going to be okay. I don't know if I can receive him." And the psychologist, the therapist, changes the question and says, "Well, if you decide to be okay when your son arrives, well, if that is the case, local governments need to pay a lot of attention to see how we execute our own policies to change the reality of so many human beings beyond their differences in terms of age or gender, so that they all can have the same possibilities of progressing. And as the Agenda 2030 states, nobody is left behind." And today, I want to stress this with this example, because the City Council of Barcelona has generated technical capacity of work with Peñalodén that has provided good outcomes, and we continue moving forward, for instance, in environmental policies and local policies. It is now more visible when we are seeing climate change, and we're actually almost touching climate change, and we see this is one of the great challenges we will face within our local governments in Peñalolén, with its very different geography to what's this part of the city, which is central. In Peñalolén, we have access to the mountain, but in this land, there's private property. And what the local government does is to raise awareness amongst these groups of owners of that natural space that the time has come for the citizens to have access, free access, and for free to those physical spaces that help us progress, help us with our mental health, and that mainly nature should have no owner, because we are all sons and daughters of Mother Nature. Thank you very much. Thank you. 3 very interesting contributions. We have one last input. Very short, please, because we're absolutely out of time. Thank you, Milagros. It is a great pleasure. This is a very inspiring panel. My name is Laura Perez. I'm currently General Secretary of CIDE, which is the Ibero-American Center for Strategic Development, Urban Strategic Development, with headquarters in Barcelona. And I must say that I'm a former councillor in Barcelona up until the month of June. I wanted to offer you a reflection, because at CIDE we accompany Ibero-American citizens in their midterm planning, how we think about the urban challenges in the mid-run and long run. The 4 years establishing the different terms and mandates have a different pace to those paces of the challenges we're speaking about. And I was thinking that perhaps this panel on human rights was related to this the least, but when I heard you, it was quite the opposite. First, reason is because increasingly urban planning, taking the international agenda into account, the SDGs or Habitat 3 also marked the different shared lines of the agenda that my colleague was mentioning before, challenges on how to land all these things. This planning is becoming increasingly difficult, and it is more connected to the problems that have been tackled and some of the comments you've made in the panel. So it would be a mistake to understand that this is connected to the right to the land, with the right to a life free of violence by women or other sustainability pillars in life that Luz Amparo from Bogota explained very well. I do believe there are terminologies talking about human rights in the agenda that we have not been able to land to the city, perhaps thinking that they were too big for us, so fighting against driven violence or the perspective of security sometimes imposed from states, not agreeing with the rights of citizens. But I do believe that we need to land it all, and care is one of the essential pillars from this narrative of taking care of people, taking care of the planet, taking care of our spaces. And in that sense, this is very much related to what you have mentioned in the panel from the human rights perspective. I don't know whether I have time for my question, but I am interested in the mid and long run regarding everything that has been mentioned here today, but I have a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Well, thinking about the short term is complicated. It's even more complicated to think about the mid and long term, but if is anybody daring to give a 1-minute answer, then that will be fine. And if not, Marta Nin will be summarizing the panel, or she herself can probably answer this question. Ms. Marta Nin will not dare to do this, but there's been 4 potential contributions in this panel, and the 4 have come from women. And human rights and women are 2 things that are very much interconnected. And luckily, this happens in the world as well. Many women working in human rights and their defense. I have been making some notes, and I'm going to give you a summary. So, human rights approach from a municipal structure beyond the mayor or mayoress. We need to recover the trust of citizens. Local governments must guarantee freedoms and rights of participation and opinion. For a local government to be real, there must be an alliance with the human rights advocates to humanize politics. We need to change the local development measures and actions. Participation of citizens is what builds up public things. We need to understand that there should not be a vertical relationship between European Union and Latin America. The European Union must understand that there's a lot to learn from Latin America, and Latin America has a lot to propose to the European Union. Insecurity is the opposite of what advocates are looking for. There is a white elephant in the room, which is the criminal economy and organized crime, which hovers all around both in Europe and Latin America. And we need to support the different causes and citizen participation. Organized citizen participation is an essential guarantee for the protection of nature. Whenever there is minority, there can not be life. Thank you so much for the very interesting reflections and thoughts coming from this panel. Let's go to lunch, and we will see you back in an hour. Please be on time. Thank you.